After Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the governments of the UK and US declared their support for the USSR in its struggle against Nazi aggression. They did not believe that the USSR would be capable of sustaining prolonged resistance to German forces. UK and US intelligence estimated this period to range from 10 days to 6 weeks, yet they remained interested in providing assistance. As was noted in US military circles, the objective was not to secure a stunning Russian victory, but to keep Germany engaged until our own weight in the war becomes decisive. Be that as it may, the vital interests of the Soviet Union and the leading Western democracies coincided, at least in the short term. On the evening of June 22, 1941, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced on the BBC his intention to provide the USSR with all possible assistance. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a similar public statement at a press conference on June 24th. On July 12, 1941, following negotiations in Moscow, the Anglo-Soviet Agreement on Joint Action in the War against Germany was signed. Both countries pledged to render mutual aid and support, refrain from entering into negotiations with Germany, and not conclude an armistice or peace treaty except by mutual consent. Similar agreements were concluded with the governments in exile of Czechoslovakia on July 18th and Poland on July 30th. Per these agreements, Czechoslovak and Polish military formations were established on the territory of the USSR. However, there is considerable evidence of ambivalent positions of the Soviet Union's future allies in the war. In particular, in a telegram dated June 22, 1941, diplomat Konstantin Umansky reported to Moscow, "The prospect of a German victory is unacceptable to Roosevelt, as it threatens England and ultimately the plans of the United States. Yet the prospect of our overly crushing victory and influence over the whole of Europe alarms him from a class standpoint." Both Washington and London sought to avoid close association with the Soviet leadership and even contemplated the possibility of regime change. As a potential leader of post-Stalin Russia, they considered Kerensky, the former head of the provisional government, who had fled to the United States. Churchill did not hesitate to write in his memoirs, "We welcome Russia's entry into the war, but it brought us no immediate assistance." It is therefore unsurprising that the UK's initial position ruled out a military alliance with the USSR and the provision of military aid to it. On August 14, 1941, at the Atlantic Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill discussed and adopted the Atlantic Charter, one of the key policy documents of the anti-Hitler coalition. It was not a treaty between the two powers, nor did it constitute a detailed official blueprint for the post-war world. As the document itself stated, it merely affirmed certain common principles in the national policies of the respective countries, the US and the UK, on which they based their hopes for a better future for the world. Nevertheless, the Charter laid the foundation for the creation of the United Nations, as well as the broader political and economic international order that would emerge after the war. The document stipulated the refusal of both powers to support territorial changes that are not in accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned, the right of nations to choose their form of government, and the restoration of sovereign rights and self-government to those peoples who have been forcibly deprived of them. Free access for all countries, great or small, to world trade and to the raw materials necessary for their economic prosperity. Global economic cooperation and the advancement of social welfare. Freedom from want and from fear. Freedom of the seas, the disarmament of aggressor states, and general disarmament after the war. At a subsequent meeting in London on September 24, 1941, representatives of the governments of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, the USSR, and Yugoslavia, as well as Charles de Gaulle's Free France, all expressed their adherence to the principles of the Charter. the Soviet Union issued a declaration of the Soviet government, which was presented at this inter-allied conference. Despite this, some UK politicians considered the opening of a second front as early as 1941 more than feasible. For instance, in a memorandum dated November 18, 1941, Lord Beaverbrook noted, "The claim that we can do nothing for Russia is nonsense. Russian resistance provides us with new opportunities. It has opened up a 2,000-mile stretch of coastline for the landing of British troops. It would be reckless on our part to wait, and we must strike while it is still not too late." However, Churchill believed it would be impossible to stage a landing in northern France or to deploy 20 to 25 UK divisions in the Arkhangelsk region or in the southern areas of the USSR via Iranian territory, a plan proposed by Stalin in September 1941. In his famous speech on November 6, 1941, Stalin had full moral grounds to declare the following: "One of the reasons for the failures of the Red Army is the absence of a second front in Europe against the German fascist forces. Our country is waging a war of liberation alone, without anyone's assistance, against the combined forces of the Germans, Finns, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians." The only achievement the Soviet Union managed to secure from the US and the UK was military supplies, as agreed at the Moscow Conference from September 29th to October 1st, 1941. The US and the UK committed to delivering 400 aircraft, 500 tanks, 200 anti-tank rifles and other military materials to the USSR on a monthly basis from October 1941 to June 1942. In turn, the Soviet government pledged to supply the Allies with raw materials for the production of military goods. The country was also granted an interest-free loan amounting to $10 billion. On November 7, 1941, Roosevelt decided to extend the provisions of the Lend-Lease Act of March 10, 1941 to the Soviet Union. Under this law, the United States supplied weapons and equipment to any country whose defense was deemed vital to US security. Materials provided under Lend-Lease that were destroyed, lost, or consumed during the war were not subject to any payment after its conclusion. The remaining items were to be paid for in full or in part and could be recalled if necessary. Lend-Lease assistance unquestionably strengthened the military capabilities of the USSR. Overall, these supplies accounted for approximately 7% of all goods produced in the country during the war years. In terms of value, US deliveries to the USSR, including transportation costs and services, amounted to about $13.2 billion, or roughly 25% of the total US Lend-Lease expenditures. The assistance was particularly significant for certain types of aid, such as tanks, aircraft, and especially trucks, canned goods, and other provisions. Assessing the significance of Lend-Lease, Soviet statesman Mikoyan believed that without it, we would certainly have had to fight for another year or a year and a half. However, Soviet soldiers and officers jokingly referred to US canned goods as the second front, thereby emphasizing that the Allies had long failed to provide substantial and decisive assistance. Until 2024, Russia continued to remain a debtor for the wartime supplies received from the United States. All other recipients of comparable aid had their debts to the US written off as early as 1972. The ties between the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition became more tangible during the Battle of Moscow, not only because the successful Soviet counteroffensive shattered the Nazi blitzkrieg doctrine, but also due to Japan's surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and the UK did the same. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the US. However, even after these events, the positions of the UK and US changed very little. At a meeting in Casablanca on January 1943, Chief of US Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King still framed the primary focus of Anglo-American policy as providing the human resources of Russia and China with the necessary equipment so that they could fight. Instead of opening a second front in Europe in December 1941, Churchill proposed a plan for an Anglo-American occupation of all French possessions in North and West Africa and the establishment of control over these territories, as well as the UK's control over the entire North African coast from Tunisia to Egypt. Some American military leaders, led by Eisenhower, insisted on coordinating operations with the Red Army in North France as early as 1942. For a time, Roosevelt also supported this position. This stance was confirmed during a meeting between the US President and Molotov in late May 1942. However, even then, Roosevelt said that the possible landing of 6 to 10 divisions in northern France would be contingent on a reduction in US military supplies to the USSR from 4.4 million to 2 million units. Churchill reacted to the Soviet-American agreements with remarkable speed. Already on June 19, 1942, he arrived in the US with a prepared plan to exchange Bolero Sledgehammer, the invasion of northern France, for Gymnast, the landing in North Africa. On July 14th to 15th, despite military assurances that a North African landing was premature and an ineffective alternative to forcing the English Channel, Roosevelt decided in favor of Gymnast. This decision resulted in a global war taking on an even more destructive and protracted character, condemning millions more people to a terrible death. By cancelling Bolero, the Allies did not abandon their plans to halt military deliveries to the USSR until January 1943. According to Stalin's statement to Roosevelt's personal representative Wilkie, US shipments to the USSR had already fallen by 50 to 60% by August to September 1942, and some supplies intended for the USSR were actively intercepted by the UK. In the first half of 1943, the USSR received only 240,000 tons of military supplies from the US, a figure that pales in comparison with the corresponding shipments to the UK, 11.7 million tons for the entire year of 1943. An interesting pattern emerged in relation to the volume of military aid to the USSR and the situation on the Eastern Front. In the run-up to and during Germany's largest operations, the flow of military shipments to the Soviet side sharply declined, particularly among the most efficient route, via Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Red Army's offensive at Stalingrad and the landing of UK and US forces in North Africa essentially began simultaneously, on November 8th and 19th respectively, but were carried out without any operational coordination. In addition, the UK and US reached a consensus regarding possible operations in Sardinia, Sicily, and the Balkans. This decision was subsequently confirmed at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. In February 1943, the Allies informed Stalin of their decision not to open a second front in Europe that year, emphasizing that it could only be opened in the future if the enemy was sufficiently weakened and if success could be guaranteed. At the Third Washington Conference, held from May 12 to May 25, 1943, the date for the opening of the Second Front in Normandy was postponed until spring 1944, even though Churchill believed the operation would still be unfeasible in 1944. In response to the Allies' duplicity, the Soviet side recalled its ambassadors from Washington and London. On June 4th, Roosevelt notified Moscow that the Allies had decided to provide the USSR with air support. However, this air offensive could not serve as a substitute for the Second Front. It failed to address the main issue. The flow of weapons and equipment to Wehrmacht forces in the Eastern Front did not diminish until mid-1944. Moreover, the situation on the Soviet-German front only had a minimal influence on the intensity of air raids on Nazi targets. In the autumns of 1941 and 1942, when the Germans came closest to achieving success, the UK and US air forces curtailed their activity in the European theatre, with some forces diverted to secondary directions. Since 1941, the Soviet side had insisted on striking the oil production centres under Nazi control. However, These targets were only incorporated into air campaign plans in 1944. It was only from late 1943 that the US and UK began seriously urging Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, Spain, and Portugal to reduce shipments of strategic raw materials, military equipment, and weapons to Germany. This effort, however, was synchronized not with the needs of the Eastern Front, but exclusively with preparations for Operation Overlord. Moreover, pressure on these countries often met with resistance. For example, Swedish Foreign Minister Günther warned that if the pressure from the US and UK continued, he might make public the contents of all correspondence, from which it would be evident that trade between Sweden and Germany was conducted on a contractual basis, known to the Allied governments and concluded with their prior consent. In summer 1943, the US Office of Strategic Services was evaluating the feasibility of turning the full power of still strong Germany against the Soviet Union. The situation was fundamentally altered by the Soviet victory at Kursk. The Allies began to fear that without a second front, countering the Soviet advance would be impossible. Already on August 10th, at a meeting with military leaders, Roosevelt rejected the idea of a second front in the Balkans in favor of a landing in Normandy. Churchill broadly agreed with the president's position, but said the opening of the second front must be contingent on the deployment of no more than 12 German divisions in France and the Netherlands. Yet even in this case, the Allies were guided not by a desire to coordinate their actions with the USSR, but by the aim of beating the Russians in occupying territories in Western, Central, and Southern Germany, as well as certain areas of Italy and Southeastern Europe. These decisions were confirmed at the Quebec Conference in August 1943. The conference also addressed how to halt the advance of Soviet forces into Europe, keeping them as far from Berlin as possible. As a result, in addition to Operation Overlord, a top-secret plan codenamed Rankin was approved, which aimed to direct the full power of undefeated Germany against Russia. At the Foreign Ministers' Conference in Moscow in October 1943, a protocol was signed confirming the intentions of the US and the UK to launch an operation in northern France in spring 1944. The US anticipated that its forces would be the ones to occupy Berlin. At the Tehran Conference from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, the leaders of the Big Three met for the first time to resolve fundamental issues regarding the actual war and the post-war order. The conference's final document recorded that the crossing of the English Channel would be undertaken in May 1944. Seeking to safeguard the operation, the Allies stipulated that the Germans should not be able to transfer more than 15 divisions from other fronts during the first 60 days of the operation. Stalin assured the Allies that Soviet forces would launch an offensive during this period to provide the redeployment of German troops. The Tehran Conference also addressed the post-war order in Europe. The Allies agreed to transfer part of Eastern Prussia to the Soviet Union and to restore an independent Poland within its 1918 borders. The incorporation of the Baltic states into the USSR was also recognized. In exchange for these concessions, Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan no later than 3 months after Germany's defeat. These agreements significantly contributed to the expedited and victorious conclusion of World War II. On June 6, 1944, the leading elements of US, UK, and Canadian forces landed in Normandy. Simultaneously, French resistance units cut German communications, disrupted power supplies, and blocked movement along railways and highways. By June 12th, in the landing zone, 15 fully equipped Allied divisions took on 9 German divisions, which had suffered heavy losses over the previous week due to intensive air and naval bombardments of their positions. While demonstrating the full power of their military strategy on the Eastern Front, the German forces on the Western Front acted in an amorphous and disorganized manner. In July 1944, the operational passivity of the Allies appeared almost theatrical. This was the result of a series of negotiations between the German opposition to the Hitler regime and the Western Allies, which aimed to overthrow the Nazi regime, arrange surrender to the Western powers, and prevent Soviet forces from entering German territory. The most severe test for the Western Front came during the Battle of the Ardennes in late 1944. Yet even there, the situation was resolved thanks to the actions of the Soviet forces, which, at the Allies' request, launched a broad offensive along the entire Central Front. In the final stage of World War II, the Allies came out with a series of fundamental decisions that defined the main features of the post-war order. At the Crimea Yalta Conference on February 4th to 11th, 1945, the Big Three leaders agreed upon plans for the final defeat of Germany, the conditions of its surrender, the occupation framework, and the mechanism of Allied control. The occupation, in which France participated on equal terms with the major powers, was carried out with the goals of demilitarizing, denazifying, and democratizing Germany. The USSR's claims for German reparations in the amount of $10 billion were recognized as legitimate. The Declaration on Liberated Europe, adopted at the Yalta Conference, stipulated the need to eliminate any traces of Nazism in the liberated countries of Europe and to establish democratic institutions according to the freely expressed will of their peoples. On this basis, the USSR strengthened its position in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. At the conference, Stalin confirmed his pledge to enter the war against Japan and obtain the Allies' agreement to the restoration of Russia's former rights that had been violated by Japan's treacherous attack in 1904, including the return of the southern part of Sakhalin to the Soviet Union, the transfer of the Kuril Islands, the use of Port Arthur as a naval base, and rights to the Chinese Eastern Railway. From August 1945, the railway was jointly managed by the USSR and China. In 1952, the Soviet rights to the railway were transferred to China free of charge. At Yalta, it was also decided to convene a United Nations conference in San Francisco on April 25, 1945, for the countries that had declared war on the common enemy by March 1, 1945, with the aim of drafting the Charter of an International Security Organization. However, even here, the Western Allies attempted to act outside their agreed-upon arrangements. This primarily concerned the US effort to accept Germany's military surrender unilaterally, in violation of the surrender terms approved at the Yalta Conference in 1945. On May 7th, in Reims, Colonel General Jodl signed the act of Germany's military surrender. The surrender was accepted on behalf of the US and UK by Chief of Staff of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, Bedell Smith, and on behalf of the USSR by Major General Suslaparov. Lacking instructions from Moscow, Suslaparov stipulated that signing this act would not preclude the signing of any other possible document, which indeed occurred during the night of May 8th to 9th. Stalin was extremely dissatisfied with the May 7th Act because it was not signed in Berlin where Nazism had originated, and because the text of the act was initially approved only in English. In addition, the Soviet side ensured that the act included wording provided not merely for the cessation of hostilities, but also for the complete disarmament of German forces, with the transfer of weapons and military property to the local Allied commanders. The text of the surrender was ultimately approved in both English and Russian. Intense confrontation over post-war settlement issues unfolded from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, at the Berlin-Potsdam Conference of the Governments of the Victorious Powers in World War II. The Soviet delegation was headed by Stalin, the US delegation by President Truman, who had succeeded the late President Roosevelt on April 12th, and the UK delegation first by Churchill, and from July 28th by his successor as Prime Minister, Attlee. As the representative of the power that had captured the Reich's capital, Stalin felt more confident at the conference than the representatives of the other Allied powers, who attempted to advocate a hard line, a precursor to the post-war Cold War, towards the USSR. However, this stance, even in light of the US test of the atomic bomb on July 16th, did not influence the position of the head of the Soviet delegation. The firm stance of the Soviet delegation was not shaken by the openly non-allied actions of the UK and the US. The UK, for instance, continued to regard the USSR as both an adversary and a rival, as evidenced by the development of a plan envisioning a war between the UK and the US against the Soviet Union, which would have allowed the UK to alter the balance of power on the European continent in its favour. In early May 1945, just days after the Red Army captured Berlin, Churchill ordered the staff of his Joint Planning Staff within the War Office to develop Operation Unthinkable, a large-scale land, air and naval offensive against the Soviet Union. The Allies must not retreat from their current positions until we are satisfied regarding Poland, as well as the temporary nature of the Russian occupation of Germany. If these issues are not resolved before the US armies leave Europe and the Western world scales back its war effort, there is very little chance of preventing a Third World War. The date for the start of hostilities is July 1st, 1945, Thompson wrote in his plans. The initial attack was to be followed by a decisive engagement in the rural area near Znajdomul, now the city of Pila in northwestern Poland. It was intended to be a massive tank battle, far larger in scale than the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank offensive in history, in which 6,000 vehicles fought on the Kursk salient. Moreover, Thompson believed that additional forces would be required to defeat the Red Army, and he knew exactly where to obtain them, proposing to re-equip both the Wehrmacht and the SS. This proposal, although sensationally controversial, would have added 10 more divisions to the Western Army, which was already seasoned by 6 years of war. In November 1945, the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet occupation forces in Germany, Marshal of the Soviet Union Zhukov, circulated a memorandum to the Control Council in which he accused the British of maintaining organized units of the former German army in their occupation zone, arguing that the UK was failing to comply with the terms of the Potsdam Agreement. Instead of disarming and dissolving the German forces, as had been stipulated at the Tehran Conference, they were cooperating with them. The Prime Minister's chief military advisor and future First Secretary-General of NATO, General Hastings Lionel Pug Ismay, 1st Baron Ismay, reacted skeptically to the battle plan, and his doubts turned into outright horror when he read the proposal to rearm the Wehrmacht and the SS. In his view, it was completely unacceptable for the leaders of democratic countries to even contemplate such a policy. He reminded his military colleagues that for the past 5 years, the government had told the British public that the Russians had carried out the lion's share of combat operations and suffered indescribable hardships. An attack on those former allies so soon after the end of the war would be a catastrophe for morale. The UK Chiefs of Staff officially rejected this plan on June 8, 1945. Churchill expressed his regret, stating that the Red Army would soon become an invincible force. At any moment they wish, they will be able to march across the rest of Europe and drive us back to our island. The Chiefs of Staff remained unwavering. They wanted nothing to do with Operation Unthinkable and filed away the plan in a grey government folder labelled Russia, Threat to Western Civilization, with each page stamped in red ink marked Top Secret. This entire episode only became widely known on May 23, 2021, through Milton's article in The Telegraph titled Operation Unthinkable, Churchill's Top Secret Plan to Invade Russia. However, on June 29, 1945, preempting the UK Prime Minister's folly, the seemingly invincible Red Army repositioned its forces and prepared for defense, and as a result, the order to attack was never issued. Despite the complexities of relations within the coalition, the Potsdam Conference succeeded in reaching mutually acceptable decisions regarding Germany, implementing the so-called policy of the 4 Ds: demilitarization, the dissolution of all German armed forces, and the elimination of the military industry; decartelization, the dismantling of monopolies, denazification, the prohibition of the National Socialist Party, Nazi and military propaganda, and the punishment of war criminals, and democratization, the gradual reconstruction of political life on a democratic basis. The conference also confirmed the transfer of the city of Königsberg and its surrounding region to the USSR and established new western borders for Poland along the Oder and Nesse rivers. To govern Germany during its occupation, the Control Council was established, a joint body of the USSR, the US, the UK, and France. Each side was represented by the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces in its occupation zone. On May 31, 1945, Zhukov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet occupation forces in Germany, was appointed as the representative of the Soviet High Command to the Control Council. He also headed the Soviet military administration in Germany as the Supreme Commander of the SMAG. A week prior to this appointment, the Allied leaders decided to dissolve the government of Donetsk and arrest its members along with officials of governmental institutions. With the elimination of the Nazi government, the Third Reich officially ceased to exist as a state. In the early post-war years, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. According to the general census conducted in October 1946, its population totaled 65.9 million. Of these, 17.3 million lived in the Eastern Soviet occupation zone, 22.8 million in the Northwestern British zone, 16.7 million in the Southwestern American zone, and 5.9 million in the Western French zone. 3.2 million resided in Berlin. After returning from Potsdam, President Truman ordered General Eisenhower to develop a top-secret operational plan for a possible total war against the Soviet Union. This plan, codenamed Totality, was developed as the first in a series of US military plans formulated between 1946 and 1949 for operations against the USSR involving the use of nuclear weapons, including plans such as Pincher, Broiler, Dropshot, and others. For example, Dropshot envisaged the use of nuclear weapons along with 29,000 conventional bombs against 200 targets in 100 cities and towns, aiming to destroy 85% of the Soviet Union's industrial capacity in a single strike. The number of Soviet targets slated for destruction grew from 20 cities in December 1945 to 200 cities in 1949, and ultimately to 3,261 total targets by 1957. Casualties were expected to reach approximately 6.7 million, of whom 2.7 million would be killed. The concept of nuclear deterrence did not appear in these military plans. Nuclear weapons were considered exclusively as an instrument of war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff not only adopted a first-use nuclear policy, but also identified the Soviet Union as the primary post-war adversary of the United States, even before World War II had ended. On August 9, 1945, fulfilling its Allied obligations to the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. By that time, Japan's military and economic potential had been severely weakened by defeats in the Pacific Theater. The US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th and on Nagasaki on August 9th. The world was shown the terrifying power of these new weapons of mass destruction, a demonstration pursued by US policymakers since the bombings had little military or strategic purpose. The success of the offensive operation made it possible to liberate Manchuria, northeastern China, and the northern part of Korea, a territory with a population exceeding 40 million, as well as southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands in a relatively short time. At 9:04 a.m. on September 2, 1945, the Japanese Instrument of Surrender was signed aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, which had entered Tokyo Bay. The act was signed by Foreign Minister Shigemitsu on behalf of the Emperor and the Japanese government, by General Umezu on behalf of the Imperial General Staff, by the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, US General MacArthur, on behalf of all Allied nations at war with Japan, and by Lieutenant General Derevyanko on behalf of the USSR. World War II concluded with the victory of the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition. Despite all the disagreements among the member states of the anti-Hitler coalition, important achievements were made that shaped the nature of the post-war world. From April to June 1945, the founding conference of the United Nations was held in San Francisco, during which the UN Charter was drafted and came into force on October 26, 1945. This day marked the birth of the United Nations as an instrument for maintaining and strengthening peace among nations and states. In 1945 to 1946, the Nuremberg International Tribunal was conducted and condemned Nazism before the eyes of the entire world.